3 shots shatter the peaceful twilight. A moment's pause, then two more shots ring out in quick succession. The sounds of panicked screams and running footsteps echo through the otherwise quiet suburban street. It's 7:30 p.m. on July 26, 2015, in Clifton, Salford, a moment that would mark the violent end of an era. On the ground lies a man in a spotted blue shirt, his body crumpled beside the bins he'd just wheeled out. 5 bullet wounds tell the story of his final moments. This isn't just another gangland shooting. The man bleeding out on the Manchester Road driveway is Paul Massey, Salford's most notorious figure, a man whose very name had kept the peace in these streets for over 2 decades. This is the story of a man who ruled Salford's underworld for nearly 30 years, until 5 bullets rewrote his legacy and plunged the city into chaos. This is the rise and fall of Mr. Big, a tale of power, respect, and the price paid for living in the shadows. The story of Paul Massey begins in the gritty streets of Salford during the 1960s, where poverty and hardship were as common as the smoke that billowed from factory chimneys. Born into a working-class family in the heart of Ortsel, young Paul witnessed firsthand the stark realities of life in one of Manchester's toughest neighborhoods. The eldest of 5 siblings, he grew up in a cramped up-to-down terrace house where making ends meet was a daily struggle. His parents worked tirelessly to provide, but the relentless grind of low-wage labor meant the family often went without. These early years of scarcity and adversity shaped Massey's worldview, instilling in him a keen understanding of power dynamics and the harsh truths of survival in a world that showed little mercy to the vulnerable. Salford in the 1960s was a place of raw edges and simmering tensions. It wasn't just about physical dominance, though, that played its part, but the way they carried themselves, the authority they exuded, and the unspoken rules they enforced. Unlike others who relied on brute force, Massey wielded a different kind of power. He combined intimidation with intelligence, understanding instinctively that true authority lay not in the frequency of violence, but in the ability to control its use. Into this void stepped Massey, who by now had assembled a loyal crew of fellow Salford lads. His reputation as a straightener, someone who could mediate disputes between criminal factions, began to take root. Massey wasn't just feared, he was respected. He brought order to chaos, resolving conflicts with a mix of diplomacy and the ever-present threat of force. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Massey understood that constant violence was bad for business. He saw the bigger picture and positioned himself as a mediator, a man whose word carried weight and whose decisions were rarely questioned. The security business became Massey's first foray into legitimacy, though the line between legal and illegal operations remained deliberately ambiguous. By the mid-1980s, the security firms had secured contracts with a growing number of clubs and businesses across Greater Manchester. These ventures weren't mere protection rackets masquerading as legitimate enterprises. Massey understood the importance of providing actual value. His doormen were professional, his businesses well-run, and his reputation for keeping trouble out of establishments began to precede him. As the 1990s approached, Massey's influence expanded exponentially. The Manchester music scene was exploding, with the rise of the hacienda and the city's burgeoning reputation as the birthplace of acid house. With the nightlife boom came unprecedented opportunities in the nightclub security sector, and Massey was perfectly positioned to capitalize. His firms now controlled the doors of some of Manchester's most prestigious venues, a presence that granted him not only financial rewards, but also significant sway over the city's social fabric. He diversified his operations, opening construction companies, property development firms, and security consultancies. Each venture served multiple purposes, laundering money from less legitimate enterprises, providing employment for loyal followers, and most importantly, crafting a veneer of respectability that would prove invaluable in the years to come. By the mid-1990s, Massey's power had reached its zenith. His legitimate businesses were thriving, his criminal operations were running smoothly, and his influence extended into every corner of Salford's social fabric. The nickname Mr. Big stuck, encapsulating his status as Salford's most powerful and mysterious figure. But with great power came increasing scrutiny. Rival gangs, emboldened by Massey's success, began testing the boundaries of his territory. Police operations targeting his businesses became more frequent, though proving criminal connections remained a frustrating challenge for law enforcement. By the turn of the millennium, Paul Massey had masterfully crafted two distinct personas that seemed to exist in perfect parallel: the respected community figure and the shadowy underworld boss. His most audacious move came in 2012 when he launched his campaign for mayor of Salford, a bold step that shocked both the public and law enforcement. The man, once primarily known for his deep connections to organized crime, now stood before cameras, portraying himself as a reformer and a man of the people. In carefully crafted speeches, Massey outlined a vision for a better Salford. The irony of his platform wasn't lost on the authorities. How could a man linked to criminal enterprises credibly promise to reduce crime? Yet, Massey's intimate knowledge of Salford's underbelly made him seem uniquely qualified to address its problems. For those who lived on the city's roughest streets, where survival often depended on loyalty to figures like Massey, his candidacy offered a tantalizing glimpse of hope. While his mayoral campaign ultimately ended in defeat, garnering only a modest share of the vote, it succeeded in furthering Massey's goal of legitimizing his public image. He had transformed from a figure whispered about in hushed tones to a man who appeared on television screens, articulating policy ideas and rubbing shoulders with Salford's elite. Yet as his empire expanded, so did his list of enemies. Former allies became rivals. Ambitious young gangsters sought to make their names by challenging him, and law enforcement pressure never ceased. Within his inner circle, a sense of paranoia began to creep in. Massey's rise had been meteoric, but with each new layer of power and influence, the stakes grew higher. The higher he climbed, the more there was to lose, and the more individuals who stood to gain from his downfall. By 2014, tensions in Salford's criminal underworld were nearing a breaking point. A younger, more reckless generation of criminals, unconcerned with the old hierarchies, began challenging the established order. To them, Massey's careful balancing act between legitimacy and criminality was not a mark of sophistication, but a sign of vulnerability. The criminal landscape of Salford underwent a seismic shift in the early 2010s, marking the beginning of the end for the old order that Paul Massey had maintained for decades. This new generation brought with them a different kind of violence, less discriminating, more public, and increasingly brutal. Drive-by shootings, once rare events that shocked the community, became almost commonplace. The younger gangsters dismissed Massey's careful balance of legitimate business and criminal enterprise as outdated. They saw his attempts at mediation as signs of weakness, his community standing as irrelevant to their pursuit of profit and power. The first real signs of danger appeared in 2013 when a series of seemingly minor incidents escalated into something more sinister. What began as disputes over drug territory spiraled into tit-for-tat violence that proved increasingly difficult to contain. Massey's attempts to broker peace were met with unprecedented defiance. His interventions, once treated as final verdicts, were now openly challenged. Young gangsters began to whisper that the old man had lost his touch, that his time had passed. These whispers grew louder with each passing month, as the violence continued to escalate despite Massey's efforts to maintain control. Throughout 2014, Massey made numerous attempts to restore peace to the streets he had long controlled. He called meetings with rival faction leaders, trying to establish new boundaries and agreements. But the landscape had shifted dramatically. By early 2015, the warning signs were impossible to ignore. Close associates began disappearing or turning up dead. Businesses under Massey's protection found themselves targeted with increasing frequency. Intelligence from his network of informants suggested that multiple groups were plotting to seize control of his territory. In his final months, Massey seemed to sense the approaching storm. Those close to him noticed changes in his behavior, increased security measures, fewer public appearances, more frequent changes to his routine. Yet he refused to retreat entirely from public life, maintaining his role as a community mediator even as the threats to his life multiplied. The tensions reached a breaking point in the summer of 2015. Reports of rival gangs stockpiling weapons circulated through Salford's criminal grapevine. Massey's own intelligence network brought increasingly urgent warnings of planned attacks. Yet he maintained his daily routines. The day of his murder, July 26, 2015, began like any other. The assassin, later identified as Mark Fellows, had chosen his moment carefully. As Massey moved away from his car, Fellows emerged from the shadows, submachine gun in hand. At precisely 7:27 p.m., Massey stepped out of his BMW to move his bins, an ordinary domestic task that would prove to be his last. The assassin, lurking in the shadows of a nearby church, had chosen this moment with calculated precision. Massey's routine had been studied, his habits monitored, his vulnerabilities identified. As he turned his back, the first shots rang out across the quiet suburban street. Witnesses described a figure dressed entirely in black, moving with military precision through the gathering dusk. The submachine gun's rapport echoed off the brick walls of neighboring houses, 3 shots in rapid succession, followed by 2 more after a brief pause. Massey, despite being hit multiple times, managed to stagger behind his car in a desperate attempt to escape. Blood trails would later show his final movements, a diagonal path across his driveway, trying to reach his front door. He never made it. The 5th and final shot found its mark, and Salford's most notorious figure collapsed beside his own bins, his life bleeding out onto the concrete he had walked across countless times before. The crime scene told a story of professional execution. Forensics teams recovered 5 spent cartridges, their positioning indicating the shooter's methodical approach. The bullet's trajectory suggested the killer had maintained his position, adjusting his aim with practiced efficiency rather than firing wildly in panic. This wasn't a crime of passion or a spontaneous attack. It bore all the hallmarks of a carefully planned assassination. The murder weapon, a Uzi submachine gun, spoke to the resources and connections available to those who had ordered the hit. This was no amateur operation. This was the work of organized crime at its most efficient. Police response was swift but futile. The first officers arrived within minutes of the shooting, finding Massey already beyond help. The killer had vanished into the network of alleyways and side streets that crisscrossed Clifton, leaving behind only spent shells and unanswered questions. Emergency services worked frantically at the scene, but Massey was pronounced dead at 7:48 p.m., barely 20 minutes after the first shots were fired. The speed and efficiency of the execution left even hardened detectives stunned. This was a level of professionalism rarely seen in Manchester's gangland killings. The community's reaction rippled out across Salford like a shockwave. Within hours, crowds had gathered behind the police cordons, drawn by the news that Mr. Big had fallen. The silence that descended over Salford's criminal underworld was deafening. The investigation faced immediate challenges. Despite the public nature of the killing and numerous potential witnesses, the traditional wall of silence that surrounded Salford's criminal matters remained firmly in place. Those who might have seen something suddenly developed convenient memory lapses. CCTV footage from nearby buildings mysteriously malfunctioned during crucial time frames. The breakthrough came months later, through a combination of painstaking detective work and modern surveillance technology. The killer's escape route was gradually pieced together through fragments of CCTV footage, witness statements, and cell phone data. A crucial discovery was made when investigators linked the murder weapon's ballistic signature to other shootings in the area, suggesting a connection to ongoing gang warfare. Mark Fellows, known in criminal circles as the Iceman for his cold-blooded efficiency, emerged as the prime suspect. His involvement opened new avenues of investigation, revealing connections to a younger generation of criminals who had been challenging Massey's authority. Fellows' movements in the weeks leading up to the murder showed careful surveillance of Massey's routines. The killer had used a Garmin GPS watch to track routes and timing, demonstrating a level of planning that went far beyond the typical gangland shooting. The investigation uncovered links to other high-profile crimes, particularly the murder of John Kinsella, another well-known figure in Liverpool's criminal underworld and a close associate of Massey's. The same methodology, the same precision, the same deadly efficiency connected both killings. What emerged was a picture not of random violence, but of a calculated campaign to eliminate the old guard of Manchester's criminal hierarchy. As detectives pieced together the full scope of the conspiracy, they uncovered a network of rivalries, alliances, and betrayals that had been building for years. The murder represented more than the death of one man. It was the violent culmination of a power struggle between the old-school criminals who operated by traditional codes and a new generation that recognized no such limitations. Massey's execution marked not just the end of his life, but the end of an era in Manchester's criminal history, ushering in a new and more volatile period of gangland violence. The arrest of Mark Fellows in 2018 marked a significant breakthrough in the investigation that had consumed Greater Manchester Police for 3 years. Known as the Iceman, Fellows was apprehended following a carefully orchestrated operation that brought together evidence from both the Massey murder and the subsequent killing of John Kinsella. The arrest revealed a chilling level of calculation. Fellows had used a Garmin GPS watch to plot routes and timings, approaching murder with the same precision a businessman might apply to scheduling meetings. His capture pulled back the curtain on a new breed of criminal, one who combined modern technology with cold-blooded efficiency. The trial at Liverpool Crown Court captivated both the public and the criminal underworld. Over several weeks, prosecutors methodically laid out their case, revealing the intricate planning behind Massey's execution. The evidence presented painted a picture of meticulous preparation, surveillance footage showing Fellows' scouting locations, cell phone data tracking his movements, and the damning GPS data from his watch that had mapped out escape routes. The courtroom fell silent as prosecutors described how Fellows had lurked near the church opposite Massey's home, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The clinical nature of the killing, far from hiding Fellows' guilt, became the very evidence that would condemn him. The jury heard how he had continued his normal routine after the murder, even going for a meal with his family, a detail that highlighted the psychological makeup of a man capable of transitioning seamlessly between family life and professional killing. When the guilty verdict was finally delivered, Fellows showed no reaction, maintaining the same icy composure that had characterized his actions on the night of the murder. The impact of the verdict reverberated far beyond the courtroom. Fellows' conviction brought a measure of closure to Massey's family, who had waited years for justice, but it also marked a turning point in Salford's criminal landscape. The old order, which had operated under unwritten codes and maintained a degree of stability through respected figures like Massey, had been definitively shattered. In its place emerged a more fragmented and unpredictable criminal ecosystem, where violence became more frequent and less discriminating. Salford's streets witnessed significant changes in the wake of Massey's death and Fellows' conviction. The power vacuum created by Mr. Big's absence led to a series of violent confrontations as various factions sought to establish dominance. The family's perspective on Massey's legacy remains complex and deeply personal. To them, he was more than the figure portrayed in media headlines. He was a father, a grandfather, a man who, despite his notorious reputation, had maintained strong family bonds. In Manchester's criminal history, Paul Massey occupies a unique position. His death marked not just the end of a significant underworld figure, but the conclusion of an era when criminal enterprises operated under established codes and hierarchies. The old system, for all its faults, had maintained a degree of order and predictability. Its replacement, a more chaotic, less structured criminal landscape, has proven more challenging for both law enforcement and communities to navigate. The violence that followed Massey's death served as a grim vindication of his repeated warnings about the dangers of unchecked gang warfare. The legacy of the case extends beyond its immediate impact on Salford's criminal underworld. It demonstrated the evolution of both crime and law enforcement in the modern era, how traditional gangland figures have been replaced by more technically sophisticated operators, and how digital evidence has become crucial in securing convictions. Fellows' use of GPS technology, while ultimately contributing to his downfall, highlighted how modern criminals have adapted to and embraced new technologies. Today, Paul Massey's name still resonates in the streets of Salford. To some, he represents the last of a dying breed, a criminal figure who maintained a complex balance between community leadership and underworld authority. To others, his death marks the moment when the old certainties of Manchester's criminal landscape gave way to a new, more volatile reality. The true measure of his legacy perhaps lies not in the manner of his death or the capture of his killer, but in the profound changes that followed his passing, changes that continue to shape the criminal landscape of northern England to this day.